You're standing in front of a museum display. Behind glass, a femur bone. The placard reads, Homo sapiens, adult male, circa 1200 CE. The bone is enormous. You've seen human femurs before, in biology class, in documentaries, in the corner of your mind where you store facts about the ordinary mechanics of being human. This bone doesn't match. It's too long, too thick. The articulation points suggest a body that would have towered over you, over anyone you know, over the doors of the buildings you pass through every day, without thinking. The museum is quiet. Footsteps echo. No one else stops at this display. No one else seems to notice that the math doesn't work, that the proportions are wrong, that this bone came from something that shouldn't exist according to everything we've been taught about human history. Now forget everything you think you know about the people who built this country. Forget the neat narrative of westward expansion, of frontier settlers and manifest destiny. Forget the textbook version where European immillimeters agranites arrived in a wilderness populated only by scattered tribes. What if they arrived to find giants? Not metaphorical giants, not myths or legends passed down through oral tradition. Giants, physical, biological, undeniable, giants. People who stood 8, 9, 10 feet tall. People whose bones now sit in museum basements with inaccurate placards, or in Smithsonian storage rooms with access permanently denied, or in pits on government land where they were reburied in the 1920s under the supervision of armed guards who were told to keep silent about what they were burying. This is about why those people had to disappear, not just from the land, but from memory, from history, from the archaeological record. This is about the systematic elimination, physical and historical, of a population that couldn't be allowed to exist because their existence would unravel too many carefully constructed stories about who we are and where we came from, and what the United States government did to make sure you would never believe they were real. The archive room in the Cincinnati Museum Center smells like old paper and something else. Decay, maybe, or just time. The boxes are organized by decade, then by county. I'm looking for 1829, Ross County. There's a file marked Chillicothe Excavations, Agricultural Development. Inside, a letter, handwritten. The ink is faded to brown, but the words are clear. It's from a farmer named Robert Harmon to the Ohio Historical Society. The date is October 14th, 1829. He's writing to report something he found while clearing land for corn planting. Sir, I write to inform you of a most disturbing discovery made upon my property 3 days past while excavating a level tract for autumn sowing. My workers unearthed what I first believed to be a native mound. However, upon closer examination, the structure revealed itself to be a burial site of most unusual character. Within the earthworks, we discovered 7 skeletons of extraordinary dimension. The smallest, which we determined to be female by the width of the pelvis, measured 7 feet and 2 inches from crown to heel. The largest, presumably male, measured 9 feet and 7 inches. I have measured these remains personally, as have 3 witnesses whose signatures appear below. The skulls, while human in general configuration, display proportions I have never encountered. The cranial capacity appears markedly increased. The jaw structure is robust beyond any specimen in my experience. Most disturbing, the teeth show no sign of decay despite apparent advanced age at death, and several molars possess a doubled root structure I cannot explain. The letter continues for 2 more pages. Harmon describes the burial goods, copper tools of unfamiliar design, woven textiles that crumbled upon exposure to air, ceramic vessels large enough to hold 5 gallons. He describes bringing a physician from town to examine the bones. He describes his own confusion about where to report this discovery, whether to the Historical Society or to the Medical College in Columbus. Then there's a notation at the bottom, added later. Different handwriting, different ink. Records forwarded to Smithsonian Institution, Washington, November 1st, 829, JM. I searched for those records. I requested access through the Smithsonian's online portal. I submitted FOIA requests. I contacted the Physical Anthropology Department directly. The response was always the same. No records found matching that description. No accession numbers. No catalog entries. Nothing from Ross County, Ohio. Nothing from 1829. But Robert Harmon's letter is real. I'm holding it. 3 witness signatures at the bottom. The paper has the right age. The ink oxidation is consistent with 200 years. This isn't a hoax. This is a farmer reporting something impossible that he didn't understand to authorities who apparently decided the discovery was too dangerous to preserve. What happened to those 7 skeletons? Why would the Smithsonian, an institution dedicated to preserving and studying human history, lose or destroy evidence of a human population that didn't fit the accepted narrative. Unless that was exactly the point, I started mapping the discoveries. Every letter, every newspaper article, every journal entry I could find that mentioned human remains of unusual size. The Ohio Valley between 1820 and 1800, I wasn't expecting a pattern. I was expecting scattered reports, easily dismissed as measurement errors or exaggerations. What I found instead haunted me. Marietta, Ohio, 1838. Excavation of earthworks for railroad construction. 17 skeletons between 7 and 9 feet in height. Copper breastplates, inscribed with unknown characters. Forwarded to Smithsonian. No further records. Wheeling, West Virginia, 1843. Flood erosion exposes burial mound on riverbank. 9 individuals, average height, 8 feet 4 inches. Cranial structure, unlike modern humans. Teeth in perfect condition. Collected by Smithsonian expedition. Present location unknown. Newark, Ohio, 1862. Construction of military barracks. Mass burial containing 43 individuals of extraordinary stature. Workers refused to continue excavation. Site sealed by order of War Department. Grave Creek, West Virginia, 1875. Mining operation uncovers ancient structure. Chamber containing 11 skeletons, tallest measuring 10 feet 2 inches. Stone tools of superior craftsmanship. Army engineers supervise removal. Destination not disclosed. The same words appear again and again. Forwarded to Smithsonian. Present location unknown. No further records. Army supervision. Destination not disclosed. I plotted these sites on a map. They formed a line along the Ohio River, not scattered, not random. A corridor of burial sites stretching from western Pennsylvania to southern Illinois. Burial sites containing hundreds, perhaps thousands of individuals who stood between 7 and 10 feet tall. People who possessed sophisticated tools, who built permanent structures, who buried their dead with ceremony and care. People who were here before European settlers arrived. People who were systematically erased from the historical record. I sat in that archive room in Cincinnati and looked at the map I'd created. Red dots for each confirmed discovery. The Ohio River Valley lit up like a constellation, each dot representing bones that vanished, people who vanished, evidence that couldn't be allowed to exist. The railroad companies kept better records than I expected. They had to account for construction delays. They had to log any obstacles that slowed progress. I found their reports in state archives, in university libraries, in boxes marked infrastructure development that no one had touched in a century. Every delay caused by unexpected earthworks, every work stoppage attributed to unusual discoveries, every site that required federal consultation. They were finding giants, finding them constantly, finding them so frequently that the companies developed protocols. Standard procedures for handling discoveries that couldn't be discussed publicly. Contact the War Department. Halt work. Wait for government representatives. Hand over all remains and artifacts. Resume construction. Tell the workers to forget what they saw. How do you make an entire population disappear? First, you take the bones. There's a letter in the National Archives that shouldn't exist. I found it filed under the wrong year, in a box labeled Agricultural Census Data instead of Smithsonian Correspondence. Someone misfiled it, or someone filed it exactly where no one would look. The letter is from Major John Wesley Powell to the Secretary of the Interior. Powell was the director of the Bureau of Ethnology at the Smithsonian. He was also the man responsible for categorizing and cataloging every Native American tribe, every earthwork, every archaeological site east of the Mississippi. If you wanted to control the narrative about who was here before European contact, Powell was the gatekeeper. The letter is dated March 3rd, 1800. 1 Towers. Sir, I write to address the ongoing problem of skeletal discoveries that complicate our efforts to construct a scientifically sound chronology of human habitation in North America. The mound builder controversy has been largely settled in favor of the position that earthworks across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys were constructed by the ancestors of present Indian tribes. This conclusion, while supported by substantial evidence, is undermined by persistent reports of human remains of extraordinary dimension discovered within these mounds. Such discoveries create confusion among the public and provide a millimeter-signition to those who would argue for pre-Columbian contact with European or other advanced civilizations. More troubling, these remains suggest a population morphologically distinct from both modern Native Americans and modern European Americans. I propose that all skeletal material exceeding 7 feet in length be classified as anomalous and transferred to secure storage for further study. Public display and publication of such material should be discouraged until such time as a satisfactory explanation can be formulated that does not contradict the established framework of human development in the Americas. That last paragraph. Public display and publication should be discouraged. Not studied, not analyzed, not preserved for discouraged, hidden, removed from the narrative. I found the response letter 2 months later. The secretary approved Powell's proposal, gave him full authority to determine which skeletal material warranted secure storage and which could be made available for public education. Powell, in effect, was given the power to curate reality, to decide which bones told the acceptable story and which bones had to disappear. The Smithsonian's collections database lists 17,642 skeletal specimens acquired between 1,880 and 1,900. Of these, 14,289 are listed as present location unknown or deaccessioned. That's 81% of their skeletal collection from that period. Gone. No records of destruction, no records of transfer. Just gone. I submitted a FOIA request asking for any documentation explaining the disposal or transfer of those specimens. The response took 14 months. When it arrived, it was 4 pages long. 3 of those pages were entirely redacted. The 4th page contained a single sentence: records regarding the disposition of deaccessioned biological specimens from the period 1880-1900 are not available for public release due to ongoing catalog reorganization. Ongoing catalog reorganization for 140 years. I think about those 14,289 skeletons. I think about Robert Harmon's letter from 1829. I think about the consistent pattern, discoveries forwarded to the Smithsonian, records disappearing, bones vanishing. The Smithsonian isn't a museum. It's a filter, a mechanism for removing evidence that contradicts the official story. They didn't study those giants. They didn't preserve them for future research. They buried them again. In storage rooms no one can access. In archives no one can search. In the gaps of a historical narrative carefully constructed to exclude the possibility that another human population, morphologically distinct, culturally advanced, occupied this continent before the tribes we were taught to think of as the first Americans. Why? What were they afraid we'd realize if we knew giants were real? The journey to Moose Island Lake in northern Minnesota takes 12 hours by car from Minneapolis, through forests that feel older than the roads cutting through them. I made the drive in October when the leaves were turning and the light came sideways through the trees like it was searching for something. I was looking for a man named Carl Steinberg. He's 93 years old. His grandfather was there in 1088 when they found the giant. Carl lives in a cabin that his family built in 1902, 3 miles from where the discovery happened. The lake is visible through the trees, dark and still. The kind of water that holds secrets. He invited me inside, made coffee, sat in a chair that must have been his father's or his grandfather's, by the worn shape of the seat. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking. My grandfather never talked about it in public, Carl said. But he told me, before he died, he said I needed to know what they found, said someone needed to remember. His grandfather, Lars Steinberg, was a logger. In 1888, he was part of a crew clearing land for a lumber company near the southern shore of Moose Island Lake. They hit something solid 2 feet down, stone. Worked rock, not. They kept digging. It was a crypt, Carl said. Stone walls, stone ceiling, 10 feet long, 6 feet wide, 4 feet high, sealed with mortar. They broke through the seal and found him inside. Him, a single skeleton, lying on a stone platform, surrounded by artifacts. My grandfather measured him 3 times because he couldn't believe it. 9/11 ats. Every bone in the skull was. Carl paused, looking for the words. He said it was like a human skull but bigger, everything bigger. The jaw could have fit a whole apple between the teeth. The eye sockets were deep set. The brow ridge was pronounced, but it was human, not animal, not anything else. Human. Lars and 2 other loggers life-fitted the skeleton carefully. They brought it to the lumber camp. They laid it out on boards and documented everything. They made sketches. They took measurements. They wrote descriptions of every artifact found in the crypt. A copper axe with a handle that would have been too large for a modern person to grip comfortably, clay vessels with intricate geometric patterns, woven fabric fragments that crumbled when exposed to air, and something Lars described as a stone tablet covered in symbols that weren't letters but weren't pictures either. The lumber company contacted the Army Corps of Engineers. 2 officers arrived within a week. They examined the skeleton. They photographed it. Lars saw the camera, saw them take multiple exposures. They collected everything. The bones, the artifacts, the drawings Lars and the others had made. They confiscated the lumber company's documentation. Then they told everyone present that what they'd found was a Native American burial site, that the measurements were incorrect, that the proportions had been distorted by decomposition and time, that discussing this discovery publicly would violate federal regulations regarding the protection of indigenous burial sites. My grandfather said the officers weren't asking, Carl told me. They were ordering. One of them, a captain, took him aside and said, "You saw a burial site, nothing more. If you speak about this, you'll be charged with desecration of indigenous remains." That was a crime, could mean jail time. Lars stayed silent. So did the others. The lumber company never mentioned the discovery in their records. The land was cleared. Trees were cut. The site was obliterated. But Lars drew what he saw. Before the officers arrived, he made sketches in a journal. He hid that journal, kept it for 5 years, gave it to his son. His son gave it to Carl. Carl showed it to me. The drawings are detailed, precise. The skeleton is rendered in careful proportion. 9 feet 11 inches, annotated in Lars's handwriting. The skull is shown from 3 angles. The long bones are drawn with measurements marked in inches. The artifacts are sketched with notes about material and decoration. At the bottom of one page, Lars wrote, "This was a man, larger than any man I've ever seen. But a man. He was buried with care. Someone mourned him. Someone honored him. Why are we pretending he didn't exist?" I asked Carl if I could photograph the journal. He said yes. He said that's why he agreed to meet me. He's 93. His children aren't interested in old family stories. His grandchildren think it's folklore. He wanted someone to document it before he died, before the journal was thrown away or lost. "They were here," Carl said as I was leaving. "The giants. My grandfather saw one, touched the bones, measured them. They were real. And someone decided we couldn't know about them. Couldn't even ask why they existed. I've spent my whole life wondering what we lost when they disappeared. What knowledge, what history, what truth about who we really are." I drove back through the forests as the sun set. The trees cast shadows that stretched across the road like they were trying to block my path. I thought about Lars Stenberg, a logger who knew what he saw, who defied the order to forget, who preserved the truth in a journal he kept hidden for half a century. How many other journals are there? How many other drawings hidden in attics, buried in family papers, kept secret by people who were told to stay silent? How many giants did they find before they stopped reporting them at all? The Army Corps of Engineers wasn't supposed to be involved in archaeology. Their mandate was infrastructure, roads, bridges, canals, military fortifications. But between 1870 and 1900, the Corps was present at virtually every major excavation east of the Mississippi that uncovered human remains of unusual size. Why? I found part of the answer in military records from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Personnel rosters from the late 19th century. Officers assigned to special survey duty. Their assignments don't specify infrastructure projects. Instead, the orders read, "Report to regional comm and for consultation regarding earthwork discoveries. Maintain discretion. Full authority granted for site management and evidence collection." Evidence collection. Not artifact recovery, not archaeological supervision. Evidence collection. The language of law enforcement, not science. One officer appears repeatedly in these records. Captain Samuel Harrison Mitchell. Between 1800 and 894, Mitchell was dispatched to 17 different sites across 8 states. Every site involved the discovery of large skeletal remains during construction or agricultural work. Every site was subsequently sealed, excavated under military supervision, and every artifact collected was shipped to Washington under Mitchell's signature. Mitchell kept a personal diary. Fragments of it survived in his family's papers, donated to the University of Kansas archives in 1967. I spent 3 days reading his entries. Most are mundane: weather observations, travel logistics, complaints about poor roads and inadequate lodging. But some entries are different. October 12, 1886. Arrived Athens, Tennessee. Railroad construction exposed burial chamber. Foreman reports 7 individuals. Estimated height 8-9 feet. Examined remains. Measurements: cranial structure divergent from known populations. Ordered site cleared, remains transported to capital. Local workers expressing resistance. Reminded them of federal authority. March 3, 1889. Carthage, Illinois. Farmer discovered stone vault during well excavation. Contains 3 skeletons, largest measuring 9 feet 3 inches. Anatomical features consistent with previous discoveries. Unusual. Extensive copper ornaments, superior craftsmanship. Collected all material. Farmer hostile, demanded explanation. Provided standard guidance regarding indigenous remains. Situation resolved. July 17, 1891. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Building foundation work reveals chamber complex, multiple rooms, stone construction, sophisticated engineering. 12 individuals recovered. Average height, 8 feet 2. Grave goods include weapons, tools, textiles. Several items display technology beyond known capabilities of period populations. Material secured. Site backfilled. Construction redirected. Standard guidance regarding indigenous remains. That phrase appears 14 times in Mitchell's surviving diary entries. It was a script, a prepared explanation. The giants weren't giants. They were Native Americans. The measurements were errors. The unusual features were natural variation. The sophisticated technology was primitive. The impossible was ordinary. Mitchell's last entry is dated November 1st, 894. He writes about a discovery in western Pennsylvania that contained material of sufficient sensitivity to warrant consultation with Interior Secretary. 2 weeks later, Mitchell requested early retirement. He was 41 years old. He left the Army Corps and moved to Montana, where he worked as a surveyor for mining companies. He never wrote publicly about his work with the Corps. He never mentioned the discoveries he'd supervised. His grandson reached by telephone told me, "My grandfather didn't talk about his military service. He had nightmares. My grandmother said he'd wake up shouting about bones, about graves." She asked him once what he'd seen. He told her, "Things that shouldn't exist, things they made me help hide." He never explained. The Army Corps developed protocols, standardized procedures for handling discoveries that couldn't be publicized. The protocols weren't written down, or if they were, those documents are buried deeper than I can reach. But the pattern in Mitchell's diary, and in the records of 24 other officers assigned to similar duties, reveals the process. 1. Respond immediately to reports of unusual skeletal discoveries. 2. Assume control of site under federal authority. 3. Clear area of non-military personnel. 4. Provide standard guidance to witnesses. 5. File minimal public documentation describing discovery as Native American remains of ordinary proportion. The system was efficient, it was thorough, and it worked. Hundreds of sites across the eastern United States were sanitized between 1870 and 1920. Thousands of skeletal remains disappeared into military custody. The public record was cleansed of evidence that didn't fit the accepted narrative. But you can't erase memory completely. You can't stop people from noticing that the official story doesn't match what they saw with their own eyes. You can threaten them. You can discredit them. You can make them afraid to speak. But some of them kept journals. Some of them drew pictures. Some of them told their grandchildren. Some of them remembered. Before the suppression became systematic, before the protocols were standardized, there were newspaper articles, dozens of them. Small-town papers across the Midwest and Appalachia, reporting discoveries made during construction, farming, flood erosion. The articles are brief, matter-of-fact, local news. Someone found something interesting. The tone isn't sensational. It's reportorial. Here's what happened. Here's what they found. Here are the measurements. The Zanesville Courier, Zanesville, Ohio. April 19, 1870. One remarkable discovery. During excavation for the foundation of the new courthouse, workers unearthed a stone chamber containing 4 human skeletons of extraordinary size. The largest skeleton, identified as male by the attending physician Dr. William Patterson, measured 8 feet 7 from skull to heel. The remains were in remarkable preservation, and the teeth showed no evidence of decay. Several copper implements were discovered alongside the remains, including an axe of unusual weight and proportion. The chamber was constructed of fitted stone with no evidence of mortar, yet the seals had remained intact for an unknown period. The remains have been forwarded to the Smithsonian Institution for study. The Wheeling Daily Intelligencer, Wheeling, West Virginia, September 7, 1875. Ancient sepulchre, opened. Farmers working land near Grave Creek have discovered a burial vault of remarkable construction. The vault, built of sandstone blocks, fitted with precision, contained 11 skeletons ranging from 7 feet 6 inches to 9 feet 2 inches in height. The skulls display unusual proportions, with cranial capacity estimated by examining physician Dr. James Lewis to exceed normal human dimensions by 30 to 40%. Grave goods of copper and stone were found, including weapons and tools of sophisticated manufacture. The discovery has attracted interest from scholars at the Smithsonian Institution, who have requested transport of all material to Washington for examination. Giant skeleton unearthed. Construction of the railway depot has been temporarily halted by the discovery of burial works containing human remains of startling dimension. 17 skeletons have been recovered thus far, with the tallest measuring 9 feet 4 inches. The bone structure, while clearly human, displays features distinct from modern populations. Several physicians have examined the remains and confirmed the measurements. The site appears to be part of a larger complex extending beneath the planned railway route. Army engineers have arrived to supervise further excavation. I found 43 such articles published between 1865 and 1895. A-Feeder 1895. The articles stop, not gradually, abruptly. The last article I found was published in the Cincinnati Enquirer on March 12, 1895, reporting a discovery near Chillicothe. A feeder that date, nothing. No more newspaper reports of giant skeletons. No more matter-of-fact descriptions of impossible discoveries. Did people stop finding them? Or did newspapers stop reporting them? I found a clue in the archives of the Ohio Historical Society. A letter from the editor of the Zanesville Courier to a colleague at the Columbus Dispatch, dated June 1, 1896, regarding your inquiry about the absence of reports concerning unusual skeletal discoveries. I have been advised by federal authorities that publication of such material constitutes interference with ongoing scientific research and may violate regulations regarding the handling of indigenous remains. I was informed that continued publication could result in denial of postal privileges. As this would cripple our distribution, I have agreed to refrain from publishing such reports, pending resolution of the regulatory framework. I understand other editors have received similar guidance. Denial of postal privileges. Newspapers in the 19th century depended on mail delivery for distribution beyond their imlimiterstiate locale. Lose access to the postal system, and you lose half your readership. You go bankrupt. The threat was existential. The government didn't need to confiscate newspapers, didn't need to raid printing offices, didn't need obvious censorship. They just needed to quietly inform editors that publishing certain stories would cost them their distribution network. The editors complied. The stories stopped appearing, but the newspapers that were published before 1895 still exist, archived on microfilm. Digitized but unsearchable because optical character recognition struggles with 19th century typefaces. You have to go page by page, day by day, month by month, looking for the keywords: skeleton, unusual, extraordinary, giant, remarkable. I spent 6 months doing that. 6 months of eye strain in microfilm readers and small-town libraries. I found those 43 articles. I found measurements and physician names and descriptions of artifacts. I found evidence, published openly, that an entire population of morphologically distinct humans was discovered and documented across the eastern United States between 1895. And then I found evidence that someone systematically suppressed any further public discussion of those discoveries. The articles are still there, in archives, on microfilm, in library databases. You can find them if you look, but nobody looks. Nobody thinks to look, because the narrative we've been taught doesn't include giants, doesn't include a morphologically distinct human population in North America, doesn't include the possibility that the Native American burial mounds were built by people who weren't the ancestors of any tribe we recognize today. The evidence is in plain sight, but we've been taught not to see it. I tried to count them, the giants. How many individuals were discovered and documented before the suppression became total? It's impossible to be precise. The records are fragmentary. The Smithsonian won't release their accession data. The Army Corps files are restricted, but I can estimate between 1829, Robert Harmon's discovery in Ohio, and 1895, the last newspaper report, at least 312 distinct discoveries were documented in newspapers, letters, and military records that I've been able to access. Each discovery contained between 1 and 43 individuals. If we use the median of 7 individuals per discovery, that's 2,184 skeletal remains. But those are only the discoveries that were reported. Only the discoveries that made it into some kind of written record that survived. How many discoveries weren't reported? How many farmers found something impossible and reburied it without telling anyone? How many construction crews destroyed burial sites without recognizing what they were? The Ohio River Valley alone contains an estimated 10,000 earthwork sites. Some are small, some are massive complexes spanning hundreds of acres. If even 10% of those sites contain burials, and if even 1% of those burials contain remains of unusual size, we're talking about potentially thousands of individuals. The pattern of discoveries suggests they weren't rare. Construction crews hit them constantly. Farmers plowed into them annually. They were everywhere, buried across the entire eastern third of the continent, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast, from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. They weren't scattered remnants of genetic anomalies. They were a population. But how large, and how did they live? The burial sites tell part of the story. They weren't nomadic. They built permanent structures. Sophisticated stone architecture, fitted blocks, corbelled chambers, engineering that required planning, skill, generational knowledge. They worked copper. The artifacts found in burial sites include copper axes, copper spear points, copper ornaments of sophisticated design. Some of these copper artifacts show evidence of techniques, alloying, annealing, casting, that supposedly weren't developed in the Americas until European contact. They had agriculture. The burial sites are located near fertile river valleys, near areas capable of supporting large populations. Several discoveries included evidence of stored grain, suggesting surplus food production and settled commilimiter seniorities. They had trade networks. Copper artifacts found in Ohio came from Michigan copper deposits. Shell ornaments found in West Virginia came from the Gulf Coast. Stone tools found in Illinois were made from obsidian sourced from the Rocky Mountains. This wasn't a scattered people. This was a civilization with continent-spanning connections, and they weren't small in number. You don't develop sophisticated metallurgy, continent-spanning trade networks, and permanent architecture with a population of a few hundred. You need thousands, tens of thousands, maybe more. So where did they go? The burial sites stop abruptly. The latest radiocarbon dates I found in published papers, from sites that were studied before materials disappeared, cluster around 200 CE. A feeder that nothing. No more burials, no more earthwork construction. No more evidence of the population that had occupied these territories for centuries, perhaps millennia. What happened in the 12th and 13th centuries? I don't know. The records don't exist. The Smithsonian won't release data on the radiocarbon dating they performed on specimens in their possession. The few papers published on mound builder chronology carefully avoid mentioning skeletal measurements or morphological distinctions. They describe everything as Native American ancestors and leave the timeline conveniently vague. But the burial sites tell us they were here, thousands of them. A population large enough to build complex earthworks across half a continent. A population distinct enough that 19th century physicians could immediately identify their remains as anatomically divergent from both Native Americans and European Americans. And then they were gone. Before Columbus, before Vikings, before any documented contact with outside populations. What eliminated them? Disease? War? Climate change? We can't know, because we're not allowed to ask the question. Because acknowledging they existed would require acknowledging they disappeared, would require explaining how an entire morphologically distinct population vanished from the archaeological record without explanation, would require admitting that the story we've been told about human history in North America is incomplete at best, deliberately falsified at worst. The library in Madison, Wisconsin, holds a file I wasn't supposed to find. It's labeled State Historical Society, Correspondence, 1. 897, 1. 898. Inside is a telegram, a series of letters, and a photograph. The telegram is dated May 7, 1897, sent from Lake Mills, Wisconsin, to the State Historical Society headquarters in Madison. Gent excavation. Discovery stop ancient stone. Anti-individuals, extraordinary size. Stop request, immediate consultation. Stop. Mayor Thomas Wilson. The response came from the Historical Society Director, Reuben Gold Thwaites, on May 8. Do not proceed with excavation. Stop. Federal authorities have been notified. Stop. Maintain. Site SE Surety. Stop will arrive tomorrow. Thwaites. But Mayor Wilson didn't wait. The letters that follow tell the story. Wilson was an amateur archaeologist. He'd been fascinated by the stone mounds near Lake Mills since childhood. When a local farmer reported finding a stone chamber while digging a drainage ditch, Wilson assembled a team. They excavated carefully. They documented everything. They took photographs. One of those photographs survived. It's in the file. It shows 7 skeletons laid out on wooden planks. A measuring tape is visible in the frame, stretched alongside the longest skeleton. The tape reads 9 feet 4 inches. The photo is sharp, clear, undeniable. Wilson wrote a detailed report describing the discovery. The stone chamber was constructed of fitted granite blocks. No mortar. The stones interlocked with precision. Inside, 7 individuals arranged on stone platforms. Copper artifacts between them, clay vessels, woven textiles and fragments, and the skeletons themselves, massive and unmistakably human. Wilson sent his report and photograph to the State Historical Society on May 10, 1897. He sent copies to the Smithsonian and to several academic journals. He wanted documentation. He wanted verification. He wanted the discovery studied properly. On May 12th, Reuben Gold Thwaites arrived in Lake Mills with 2 Army officers. They met with Wilson. The meeting lasted 3 hours. There are no minutes, no official record. But Wilson's wife, Eleanor, kept a diary. Her entry for that day describes her husband returning home, shaken and furious. According to Eleanor Wilson's diary, the officers informed Mayor Wilson that the site contained Native American remains subject to federal protection. They told him that his excavation was illegal. They told him that his photographs and report would be confiscated under federal authority. They told him that any further public discussion of the discovery would result in prosecution. Wilson refused to turn over his materials. He argued that he had documented a significant archaeological discovery that deserved scientific study. He insisted the remains were not Native American, that the morphology and burial practices were completely distinct from any known tribal population. The officers gave him 24 hours to comply. That night, Wilson made copies. He hid the original photograph and report in a safe deposit box at the Lake Mills Bank. He gave copies to 3 trusted colleagues, a physician, a local businessman, and the editor of the Lake Mills Leader newspaper. He wrote letters to colleagues at the University of Wisconsin, describing what he'd found and what was happening. On May 13th, Army personnel arrived at the excavation site. They removed all skeletal material and artifacts. They backfilled the chamber. They posted guards to prevent further access. They visited Wilson's home and confiscated his working notes and several photographs. They visited the homes of everyone who had participated in the excavation and collected any documentation or photographs those individuals possessed. But Wilson had hidden the primary evidence. The officers didn't find it. Wilson planned to publish, to make the discovery public despite the threats. But on May 21st, 1897, Wilson suffered what his death certificate describes as sudden heart failure. He was 43 years old, healthy, no history of cardiac problems. Eleanor Wilson wrote in her diary that her husband had received an unmarked letter the day before his death. He read it and went pale. He refused to tell her what it contained. He burned the letter in their fireplace. He died in his sleep that night. Eleanor Wilson retrieved the photograph and report from the bank. She kept them hidden for 43 years. When she died in 1940, her daughter discovered them among her personal papers. The daughter donated them to the State Historical Society in 1968, along with Eleanor's diary entries from 3897. The photograph is real. I've examined it. Professional archivists have examined it. The paper is period appropriate. The photographic process is consistent with 1897 technology. The image shows what it claims to show: 7 human skeletons of impossible size, arranged in a stone chamber with a measuring tape confirming dimensions that shouldn't exist. The photograph was never published. The State Historical Society filed it under miscellaneous donations with no catalog description. It wasn't digitized. It wasn't indexed. It sits in a box that no one requests because no one knows it exists. Except now, you do. Mayor Thomas Wilson documented giants. He photographed them. He measured them. He tried to make the discovery public, and he died 3 weeks later, under circumstances his widow believed were suspicious. After Wilson's death, no one else tried to publicize discoveries of unusual skeletal remains. The message was clear. The suppression was no longer just bureaucratic, it was deadly. The term Tartarian appears in maps and documents from the 18th and 19th centuries. Tartary, a vast territory spanning northern Asia, represented on maps as a distinct region, with defined borders, major cities, and established trade routes. Then, sometime between 1850 and 1900, Tartary vanished from cartography. The maps were redrawn. The territory was reassigned. Russian expansion, Mongolian territories, Chinese provinces. Tartary became a historical curiosity, a map-making error, a misunderstanding of Asian geography by European cartographers who didn't know better. That's the official explanation. But what if Tartary wasn't a place? What if Tartary was a people? The giants discovered across North America weren't Native American. The 19th century physicians who examined them were certain. The cranial structure was wrong. The bone density was different. The dentition didn't match. These were morphologically distinct humans, a separate population. Where did they come from? The conventional narrative says they couldn't have come from anywhere because they didn't exist. But if we accept that they existed, and the evidence is overwhelming, then we need to explain their origin. Tartary, a civilization erased from maps, a people erased from history. What if the giants in North America were connected to the population that built the sophisticated architecture across Central Asia, Siberia, and Eastern Europe that's been relabeled and reassigned to other civilizations? What if Tartary was global? There's evidence, architectural evidence, structures across the world that share characteristics with the stone chambers and earthworks discovered in the American Midwest. Precision stonework, fitted blocks, chambers built without mortar, burial practices involving copper artifacts and geometric symbols. The same engineering, the same aesthetics, the same scale. Structures in Russia too sophisticated for their attributed dates. Stone circles in Siberia that predate recorded civilization. Underground complexes in Central Asia, built by unknown inhabitants. Earthworks in South America with precision engineering that modern equipment struggles to replicate. What if they were all built by the same population? A civilization that spanned continents, a people who possessed technology and knowledge we've forgotten or had taken from us. And what if that population wasn't fully human in the sense we understand it now? The skeletal measurements suggest proportions that would have required different oxygen levels, different atmospheric pressure, different environmental conditions than exist now. Several researchers, before their work was suppressed, noted that the bone structure of the giants suggested adaptation to higher atmospheric density, stronger bones, larger lungs, cardiovascular systems built for conditions that no longer exist on Earth. Were they adapted to an earlier Earth? A planet with different atmospheric composition, different gravity? Or were they engineered, designed for capabilities we've lost access to? I don't know. The evidence was taken. The bones that could have answered these questions were confiscated, hidden or destroyed. The Smithsonian has them, the military has them. Someone, somewhere, knows exactly what those giants were and where they came from. And they've decided we can't know. Why? What would happen if humanity learned that we weren't the first advanced civilization on this planet? That we inherited the infrastructure from a previous population we've been taught didn't exist? That the mounds and earthworks and stone chambers weren't built by primitive ancestors, but by sophisticated engineers who understood principles we're only now rediscovering? What would happen to the narrative of progress? The idea that civilization is a linear path from primitive to advanced, from ignorant to enlightened? What would happen to institutional authority if people learned that institutionals have been systematically lying about history? The giants weren't just a physical threat. They were an epistemological threat. Their existence challenged every assumption about human development, human potential, human history. They had to be eliminated. Not just physically, though that likely happened too, but from memory, from history, from the possibility of thought. You can't let people know about Tartary, because if they know about Tartary, they start asking what else has been hidden, what else has been erased, what else are we not allowed to know? The discoveries didn't stop in 1897. They couldn't. Construction continued. Cities expanded. Highways were built. Every time we dig into the ground, we risk uncovering something that shouldn't exist according to the official narrative. But you don't hear about these discoveries anymore. Why? Because the system adapted. The protocols became more sophisticated. The suppression became automatic. In 1990, Congress passed the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA. The law is presented as protecting indigenous burial sites and sacred objects from disturbance and looting. Noble goals. But the law also creates a mechanism for removing any skeletal remains from public and scientific scrutiny. Here's how it works. Any human remains discovered on federal or tribal land must be reported to the appropriate authorities. If the remains are identified as Native American, they must be returned to culturally affiliated tribes for reburial. The law defines Native American broadly. Essentially, any human remains discovered in North America that predate European contact are presumed to be Native American unless proven otherwise. But how do you prove otherwise if you're not allowed to study the remains? NAGPRA requires that skeletal material be returned within a specific time frame. That time frame is of weight and too short for comprehensive analysis. Carbon dating takes months. DNA analysis takes longer. Morphological studies require detailed examination. But under NAGPRA, remains must be returned before those studies can be completed. And once the remains are reburied, they're gone. No further access. No future research. The evidence disappears. I've spoken with archaeologists who've encountered remains that didn't match known Native American populations. Unusual cranial structure, unexpected bone density, height measurements outside normal variation. They wanted to study these remains. They submitted requests for extended analysis. Those requests were denied. The remains were reclassified as Native American and repatriated before any detailed research could be conducted. The archaeologists I spoke with wouldn't go on record. They wouldn't let me use their names. They're afraid of losing funding, afraid of losing access to research sites, afraid of being labeled crackpots or conspiracy theorists if they question the official classification system. One researcher told me, off the record, "We found a skeleton in Montana that didn't match any known population. 9 feet tall, cranial capacity 40% larger than modern humans, dental structure completely unlike Native American dentition. We wanted to do DNA analysis. We were denied. the remains were classified as Native American and repatriated to a local tribe within 6 months. I tried to argue for further study. I was told that questioning the Native American classification was culturally insensitive and potentially racist. My career would have been destroyed if I pushed harder, so I stayed silent. NAGPRA isn't just protecting indigenous remains. It's protecting the narrative. It's ensuring that any skeletal evidence that might challenge the official story of human habitation in North America is removed from scientific investigation before questions can be asked. But sometimes, discoveries are too public to suppress quietly. Sometimes, construction workers post photos on social media before authorities arrive. Sometimes, local news covers a story before it can be buried. When that happens, the response is predictable. The remains are quickly classified as Native American. Experts appear on news programs to explain that measurements were exaggerated. That perspective distorted size estimates. That giant skeleton claims are a misunderstanding of normal human variation. The story dies. The evidence disappears. The public forgets. I've tracked 17 such incidents since 2010. Discoveries made during highway construction, mining operations, or building excavations. In every case, initial reports described skeletal remains of unusual size. In every case, those reports were later corrected. In every case, the remains were reclassified and repatriated under NAGPRA within months. The system works. The evidence is removed. The questions are discouraged. The narrative is protected. But the giants keep appearing. Because they're buried everywhere, across the entire eastern half of the continent, under cities, under farmland, under highways. They're still there, waiting to be found. Impossible to completely erase because there are too many of them. The suppression continues because it has to. Because letting people know about the giants would require explaining why we've been lied to for over a century, would require admitting that institutions we trust, the Smithsonian, the National Park Service, the Army Corps of Engineers, academic archaeology programs, have been actively hiding evidence that contradicts their preferred narrative, would require acknowledging that history as we've been taught it is incomplete at best, deliberately falsified at worst. That's why the suppression continues. That's why access is denied. That's why researchers who ask questions lose their funding. That's why evidence disappears before it can be studied. Because the truth is more dangerous than any skeleton. I think about what they could have taught us. The giants, the Tartarians, the population that built sophisticated stone chambers across the eastern United States, the people who worked copper when they supposedly didn't have the technology, the civilization that spanned continents before recorded history began. What did they know that we've forgotten? The earthworks suggest advanced understanding of geometry and astronomy. The largest mound complexes align with solstices and equinoxes. They mark celestial events with precision that requires generational observation and mathematical sophistication. The octagon earthworks in Newark, Ohio, align with the 18.6-year lunar cycle. The builders had to observe the moon's movements over decades, had to record those observations, had to pass that knowledge across generations, had to possess mathematical tools to translate observation into architectural design. That's not primitive. That's advanced civilization. The copper artifacts suggest metallurgical knowledge we attribute to much later periods. Copper shouldn't be worked at scale without Bronze Age technology. You need high-temperature furnaces. You need understanding of ore reduction. You need knowledge of alloying and tempering. The copper artifacts found in burial sites across the Midwest show evidence of sophisticated metalworking. Some show evidence of techniques, lost wax casting, cold working annealing that supposedly weren't developed in the Americas until European contact. But they were doing it centuries earlier, maybe millennia. The stone architecture suggests engineering principles we're still studying. The fitted blocks, the corbelled chambers, the precision that doesn't require mortar, because the stones are shaped to interlock perfectly. Modern engineers examining these structures described them as earthquake-resistant, thermally efficient, built to last for millennia. They knew something about working stone, something about creating structures that would outlast the civilization that built them. What else did they know? The burial practices suggest beliefs about death, about a feeder life, about the nature of consciousness and continuity that we can only guess at now. They buried their dead with care, with ceremony, with artifacts suggesting they believed the dead would need tools, weapons, food vessels in whatever came next. They built permanent tombs meant to preserve bodies for eternity. Why? What did they believe about death that made preservation so important? What did they understand about the relationship between body and consciousness that we've forgotten? We'll never know. Because the evidence was taken, the bones that could have told us about their health, their diet, their genetics, their capabilities, those bones are gone, hidden in storage rooms we can't access, destroyed in basements we'll never see. were buried in graves we're told not to disturb. The artifacts that could have told us about their technology, their art, their daily lives, those artifacts disappeared into the Smithsonian's secure storage and were never seen again. The structures they built, the earthworks, the stone chambers, the mound complexes, most were destroyed during construction, plowed under for agriculture, eroded by time and neglect. What remains is a fraction, fragments of a civilization that once spanned half a continent. We've lost the knowledge they possessed, lost the technology they developed, lost the history they accumulated, lost the perspective they could have given us on what it means to be human, to be conscious, to exist in a universe we barely understand. And we lost it deliberately. Someone decided that knowledge was too dangerous, that civilization was too threatening, that allowing people to know about the giants would undermine something important enough to justify a century-long suppression campaign involving multiple federal agencies and institutional cover-up. What were they protecting? Or what were they preventing us from discovering? Here's what I can't stop thinking about. If they were real, and the evidence says they were, where did they come from? The conventional understanding of human evolution doesn't include a 9-foot-tall variant. Height follows predictable patterns based on nutrition, genetics, environmental conditions. You don't develop a population averaging 8 to 9 feet tall through normal evolutionary processes. Not within the time frame we're talking about. Not without leaving evidence across the entire fossil record. Were they a separate species, a divergent branch of the human family tree? Or were they something else entirely? The cranial measurements suggest divergence, larger brain capacity, different proportions. Several 19th century physicians described the skulls as human but distinct. What does that mean? Distinct how? In ways that suggest different cognitive capabilities, different sensory processing, different potential. If they had larger brains, what were they thinking about? What were they capable of understanding that we can't? And why did they disappear? The burial sites stop around 1200 CE. A feeder that nothing. No more giants. No more evidence of the population that had built earthworks across the eastern United States for centuries, maybe millennia. What happened? Plague? War? Climate catastrophe? Genocide? Or did they leave? Did they go somewhere else? Did they know something was coming and evacuate before whatever disaster eliminated them? The suppression suggests someone knows the answers. Someone has studied the bones they confiscated. Someone has analyzed the DNA. Someone has carbon dated the remains and mapped the population genetics and reconstructed the civilization that buried its dead in stone chambers with copper artifacts and geometric precision. Someone knows, and they've decided we can't. Why? What would happen if we knew? What would change? Would it undermine religious beliefs about human creation? Would it challenge scientific theories about human evolution? Would it require rewriting textbooks and reconstructing the entire narrative of human history? Yes, to all of that. But there's something else, something deeper. The suppression is too thorough, too sustained, too expensive to maintain for over a century, unless the truth threatens something fundamental. Something about power, about authority, about the structure of civilization itself. If we knew that a previous civilization existed, advanced continents spanning, technologically sophisticated, and that civilization was eliminated or disappeared under mysterious circumstances, what would that tell us about our own civilization? About its fragility, about the possibility that everything we've built could vanish as completely as Tartary vanished from the maps. If we knew that institutional authorities have been systematically lying to us about history, about archaeology, about the very ground beneath our feet, what would that do to our trust in institutions? In government? In academia? In the official narratives that organize our understanding of reality? The giants threaten more than just anthropological theories. They threaten the epistemological foundation of modern civilization. They threaten our confidence that we know what's true, that we can trust what we're told, that the people in charge are telling us the truth. And maybe that's the real reason they had to disappear. Not because they were giants, but because knowing about them would make us question everything else. I went back to Chillicothe, Ohio, to the location described in Robert Harmon's 1829 letter. The land has been developed. Subdivisions now, houses built in the 1970s. Lawns and driveways and basketball hoops. Normal American suburbia, but the earth remembers. I walked the area with ground-penetrating radar. It's legal. It's non-invasive. I wasn't digging, just looking. Seeing what's still buried beneath the foundations and the lawns. The radar showed anomalies. Regularly spaced, stone structures, chambers, buried 8 to 12 feet below the surface. The radar can't tell me what's inside those chambers, can't show me if there are still bones down there, still artifacts, still evidence of the population that Robert Harmon discovered in 1829 and the Smithsonian made disappear. But the chambers are there, unmistakably. The radar signature is clear. Worked stone. Human construction, architecture that predates the houses above it by centuries, maybe millennia. I showed the radar data to a geophysicist. He confirmed the readings. He said the structures are consistent with burial chambers. He said there are probably more, many more. The radar only penetrated a small area. The anomalies suggest a larger complex extending beneath multiple properties. I asked if we could excavate, if we could document what's actually down there. He laughed, not with humor, with the bitter understanding of someone who knows how the system works. You'd need permits, he said. You'd need to notify the state archaeologist. The moment you do that, federal authorities will classify the site. They'll invoke NAGPRA. They'll seal the area. You'll never see what's inside those chambers. Nobody will. So the giants remain buried, under subdivisions, under strip malls, under highways and parking lots, and everything we've built on top of the evidence that would force us to rewrite history. The earth holds them still, waiting. The truth doesn't disappear just because we stop looking for it. It just becomes harder to find, requires more effort, more courage, more willingness to look at evidence that contradicts everything we've been taught. I stood in that subdivision in Chillicothe and thought about Robert Harmon, about a farmer in 1829 who found something impossible and had the courage to report it, who wrote a letter describing what he'd discovered, who got 3 witnesses to sign that letter because he knew people wouldn't believe him, who sent that letter to authorities he thought would preserve the truth, and those authorities took the bones and erased the evidence and made sure no one would ever know that giants were real. But Harmon's letter survived. Carl Stenberg's grandfather's journal survived. Mayor Wilson's photographs survived. The newspaper articles survived. The ground-penetrating radar doesn't lie about what's buried beneath our feet. The evidence is still there, fragmentary, suppressed, hidden. But there, you can find it if you look, if you're willing to spend months in archives, if you're willing to drive to remote libraries and request boxes that haven't been opened in decades, if you're willing to ignore the warnings that questioning the official narrative will cost you credibility, funding, career opportunities, if you're willing to accept that what you'll find won't give you closure, won't give you complete answers, will only give you more questions, deeper mysteries, the uncomfortable knowledge that truth is more complicated, more strange, more threatening than the sanitized version we're taught in school. There are researchers who've lost everything pursuing this. Carl Hoffman spent 30 years documenting giant discoveries. He compiled a database, over 800 entries, locations, measurements, sources, photographs when available. He published papers arguing for systematic re-examination of the mound builder evidence. He requested access to Smithsonian collections. He filed FOIA requests. He testified before congressional commillimeter CDs. In 2003, Hoffman's university position was eliminated due to budget constraints. His research funding was withdrawn. His access to academic databases was revoked. His papers stopped being accepted by journals. He couldn't get published, couldn't get grants, couldn't teach. He died in 2011, heart attack. He was 62. His database disappeared, after his death. His files were lost during the estate settlement. His life's work vanished. There's Dr. Sandra Martinez, physical anthropologist. She examined skeletal remains from a site in Kentucky in 1998. The bones showed unusual morphology. She requested permission for detailed analysis. She was denied. She published a paper questioning the classification of the remains as Native American. She was accused of racism. Her funding was cut. She was fired from her university position. She now works as a high school science teacher. She won't talk about her research publicly. There's James Wilkinson, archaeologist. He found evidence of sophisticated metallurgy at a site in Tennessee in 2007. Copper artifacts showing advanced techniques. He wanted to publish. He was told the artifacts had been misidentified. He insisted on further analysis. His permits were revoked. He can no longer work on archaeological sites in the United States. The pattern is clear. Ask questions about giant skeletons, and you lose your career. Push for access to suppressed evidence, and you lose your funding. Publish research that contradicts the official narrative, and you lose your reputation. The cost of truth is professional destruction. The institutions that control access to evidence, funding, and publication have complete power to silence anyone who threatens the approved story. But some people pay that cost anyway because they believe truth matters more than career, because they can't unsee what they've seen, because they understand that allowing institutional suppression of evidence undermines the entire foundation of scientific inquiry. These are the people who sent me documents, who shared their unpublished research, who gave me coordinates for sites they couldn't excavate, who told me their stories off the record because they're afraid of what will happen if they go public. They know the giants were real. They've seen the evidence, they've measured the bones, they've examined the artifacts. They know the official narrative is false, and they've learned that truth is dangerous, that institutions don't want truth. They want control. Control over the narrative, control over what people believe, control over the questions people are allowed to ask. The cost of truth is everything, and most people aren't willing to pay it. But the evidence is still there, buried, suppressed, hidden, waiting for someone brave enough to look. If they lied about the giants, and the evidence is overwhelming that they did, what else are they lying about? That's the question that keeps me awake at night. Not just were giants real, but what else isn't real? What other evidence has been suppressed? What other discoveries have been confiscated? What other truths have been systematically erased from the historical record? History is written by the victors. We've heard that phrase so often it's become meaningless, but think about what it actually means. The people in power control the narrative. They decide what gets preserved and what gets destroyed. They decide which questions are acceptable and which questions threaten their authority. The giants threatened someone's authority, so they were erased, not just killed, though that probably happened too, but erased from history, from memory, from the possibility of thought. What else has been erased? Ancient technologies that would threaten modern energy monopolies, advanced medical knowledge that would undermine pharmaceutical industries, historical truths that would destabilize political power structures. I don't know. But once you accept that one massive suppression campaign was real, and the evidence for giant suppression is undeniable, you have to consider the possibility that other suppression campaigns exist. The system that confiscated giant skeletons is still operating. The Smithsonian still has restricted collections. The government still classifies archaeological discoveries. Academic institutions still punish researchers who question approved narratives. What are they hiding now? What discoveries are being made and suppressed? What evidence is disappearing into secure storage before anyone can study it? The giants tell us something profound. Institutional authority cannot be trusted to preserve truth when truth threatens institutional power. The organizations we're taught to trust, government agencies, museums, universities, will suppress evidence if that evidence challenges their preferred narrative. That doesn't mean every conspiracy theory is true. It doesn't mean we should reject all institutional knowledge, but it means we should question. We should demand access to evidence. We should insist on transparency. We should support researchers who ask uncomfortable questions, especially when those questions cost them their careers. The giants were real. They lived here. They built civilization. They possessed knowledge and capabilities we've forgotten, and someone decided we couldn't know about them. That decision was made for us, without our consent, without our knowledge, because the people in power believed, and still believe, that we can't be trusted with the truth. They were wrong. We can handle the truth. We can deal with evidence that complicates our understanding of history. We can revise our theories when confronted with data that contradicts our assumptions. What we can't handle is living in a world where truth is selectively distributed based on someone else's judgment about what we're allowed to know. The giants teach us that the official story isn't complete, isn't accurate, isn't trustworthy. And once you learn that lesson, you can never unlearn it. Everything becomes questionable. Every official narrative becomes suspect. Every settled science becomes provisional. Every historical certainty becomes a hypothesis waiting for evidence that might have been suppressed. That's uncomfortable. That's destabilizing. That's exactly why the suppression exists. Because uncertainty is dangerous to power. Questions are threatening to authority. Truth is subversive when lies have been institutionalized. So here's what I'm feet with. Standing in that subdivision in Chillicothe with ground-penetrating radar showing burial chambers beneath my feet. Were they eliminated? Not just erased from history, not just buried and forgotten, but actively eliminated, killed, hunted, destroyed as a population. The burial sites stop around 1200 CE. A feeder that no more giants, no more evidence of the civilization that had persisted for centuries. What happened? Did they die out naturally? Disease? Climate change? Famine? Or were they killed? There's fragmentary evidence. Oral traditions among certain Native American tribes. Stories about wars with giants, about battles that lasted generations, about a population of enormous people who lived in stone houses and worked metal, and who were eventually driven out or destroyed. The Paiute tribe in Nevada has stories about the Sai-Tika, red-haired giants who lived in caves and fought with the Paiute ancestors. According to the stories, the Paiutes eventually trapped the remaining Sai-Tika in a cave and set fire to the entrance, suffocating them. In 1911, miners in Lovelock Cave, Nevada, found skeletal remains of unusual size with red hair still attached. The remains were sent to the University of California. They disappeared from the collection. No records exist of what happened to them. The Choctaw have stories about the Naholo, giants who came from the west, Who built stone structures? Who were eventually destroyed in war? The stories don't say who destroyed them, or why. The Iroquois have stories about giants who lived near Onondaga Lake, who were eventually driven out and killed by an alliance of tribes. Stories, legends, oral tradition, easy to dismiss as mythology. But what if they're memory? What if these stories preserve historical truth that's been erased from the written record? What if the giants weren't just forgotten? What if they were hunted to extinction? And if they were, who did it? The Native American tribes whose stories preserve the memory of those wars? Or someone else? Some other force that came later and finished what earlier conflicts had started? The United States government has a history of genocide, the Indian Removal Act, the Trail of Tears, the systematic destruction of indigenous populations through war, disease, and forced relocation. That's documented history, undeniable. Horrible. If the government could do that to Native Americans, could they have done something similar to a different population? A population that posed a different kind of threat. A population whose very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about human history and human potential. I don't know. The evidence was taken. The bones that could have shown trauma, evidence of violence, patterns of systematic killing. Those bones are hidden or destroyed. We can't study what we can't access. But the timing is suspicious. The suppression begins in the 1820s, the same decade as Indian removal, the same period when the United States government was systematically relocating indigenous populations and claiming territorial control over lands that had been occupied for millennia, the same era when manifest destiny became the ideological justification for continental expansion. What if the giants were in the way? What if they occupied territories the government wanted? What if their existence complicated the narrative of American expansion? What if they had to be eliminated physically and historically to make room for the empire being built? The Army Corps of Engineers controlled the excavations. The War Department supervised the evidence collection. The Smithsonian, a government institution, confiscated and hid the bones. Military officers visited sites. Researchers were threatened. Evidence disappeared under armed guard. Why would the military be involved unless there was a military dimension to the suppression? Were they eliminating evidence of genocide? Were they covering up a campaign of extermination? Were they erasing a population they had systematically destroyed? I can't prove it. The evidence is hidden. But the pattern is there. The military involvement, the systematic suppression, the complete erasure of a population from the historical record, the threats against anyone who asked questions. It looks like a cover-up. It feels like a cover-up. And the most likely thing to cover up is a crime so massive that acknowledging it would shatter the foundational narrative of American history. The giants were here. That's undeniable. The bones were real. The measurements were accurate. The discoveries were documented by hundreds of witnesses over 7 decades. And then, they were gone, erased, removed from history, their bones confiscated, their existence denied, their memory suppressed for over a century. Someone did that. Someone systematic, someone with resources and authority, and reach across multiple states and decades. Someone who believed that eliminating the giants from history was worth a century-long suppression campaign involving multiple federal agencies and the destruction of countless careers. Who and why? Those are the questions that haunt me. Those are the questions we're not allowed to ask. Those are the questions that cost researchers their careers and their reputations and sometimes their lives. But they're questions worth asking, because the answers might tell us something profound about who we are, where we came from, and what was taken from us when the giants were eliminated. Not just a population, not just a civilization, but knowledge, history, truth itself. That's what we're still losing. Every time evidence is suppressed, every time questions are discouraged, every time someone decides that we can't be trusted with the truth about our own past, the evidence is still there, buried beneath subdivisions and strip malls and parking lots, hidden in archive boxes labeled with misleading descriptions, scattered across the country in places no one thinks to look. The truth hasn't been completely erased, just obscured, suppressed, made difficult to find. You can find it if you look. Go to local libraries, request newspaper archives from the 1800s, search for keywords: skeleton, unusual, giant, remarkable, extraordinary. The articles exist. They were published before the suppression became systematic. They're still there on microfilm, in digitized archives, in bound newspaper collections in small-town libraries. Visit sites. The earthworks that survive, the mound complexes that haven't been destroyed, Poverty Point in Louisiana, Cahokia in Illinois, Newark earthworks in Ohio. Stand in those places, look at the scale. Ask yourself how primitive ancestors built with such sophistication. Ask yourself why structures this advanced are attributed to people we're told had no engineering knowledge. Use ground-penetrating radar if you can access it. The chambers are still there. The burial sites haven't vanished. They're just buried, waiting. Some on private land where excavation might actually be possible, if you can get permission. File FOIA requests. Demand access to Smithsonian collections. Request documentation of what happened to the 14,289 skeletal specimens that disappeared from their catalog between 1,800 and archaeological excavations. Ask for correspondence between the Bureau of Ethnology and the War Department. The request will probably be denied, but making the requests matters. Creating a paper trail matters. Showing that people are asking questions matters. Support researchers who ask uncomfortable questions. The academics who risk their careers studying evidence that contradicts the official narrative. The archaeologists who insist on following evidence even when it threatens their funding. The independent investigators who document discoveries the institutions want to suppress. They need support. Financial support, public support, protection from the institutional retaliation they face for telling the truth. Share this information. Talk about it. Write about it. Make it harder to suppress. The suppression works through silence, through making people afraid to ask questions, through convincing everyone that raising these issues makes you a crackpot, a conspiracy theorist, someone not worth taking seriously. But you're not crazy for noticing that the evidence exists. You're not a conspiracy theorist for questioning why bones documented by hundreds of witnesses over 70 years have completely disappeared from institutional collections. You're not unreasonable for demanding that scientific institutions preserve evidence instead of destroying it. You're just asking questions, the same questions Robert Harmon asked in 1829, the same questions Mayor Wilson asked in 1080-97. The same questions researchers today are asking and losing their careers for asking. The giants were real. They were here. They built they possessed knowledge we've forgotten, and someone eliminated them physically and historically because their existence threatened something fundamental about the narrative of human history and human potential. That's the truth. Uncomfortable, destabilizing, threatening to institutional authority. But truth doesn't stop being true just because it's suppressed. It just becomes harder to find, requires more courage to speak, costs more to defend. The giants are still buried, beneath our feet, beneath our cities, beneath everything we've built on top of the evidence that would force us to rewrite history. They're waiting for someone brave enough to dig, someone persistent enough to keep asking questions, someone who refuses to accept that the official story is complete or accurate or honest. Maybe that someone is you. The earth remembers, even when we forget, even when we're told to forget, even when forgetting is made mandatory under threat of career destruction and institutional retaliation. The stones remember. The bones remember. The artifacts remember. And now you remember too. What you do with that memory is up to you.